Well, it's certainly been a good while since I've done one of these, hasn't it? When it comes to Thomas and Friends, like any other show, I'm sure every fan has a favourite episode. One story that always stands out to them, one that they have a strong love for, and one that they will defend at all cost. For me, that episode has changed a few times over the years, but for the longest time, it was Rusty and the Boulder. I love the set design, the sound effects, and music. But above all else, I really loved the mystery and creepy tone it had. In recent years though, this opinion has changed slightly. I still really like this episode, but the spot of my favourite episode has gone to another one. One that I don't see many people talk about, but that I think has quite a lot to it. And that episode is, well, you can tell from the title, Toby and the Stout Gentleman. So let's get into it. The first thing I want to bring up regarding this episode is the overall look to it in terms of its visuals. Up to this point, Season 1 has pretty much looked the same in terms of the setting. An endless array of green countryside, with towns, villages and stations dotted in between. Stout Gentleman on the other hand, changes this up quite significantly. Here we're in a more mountainous region, alongside wide flat marshlands, and a very rural area, since there are no busy towns or large stations on this line. It's a very unique environment compared to the rest of Season 1, and it's also very effective in showing that this is a very different railway from the one we've seen up to this point. From just the visuals alone, it's easy to understand that this isn't the Fat Controller's railway. As I'm on the visuals, I may as well talk about the set design, which is simply brilliant. Well, I mean, all of Season 1 looks brilliant if you ask me, but Stout Gentleman in particular still really impresses me with how it manages to make these sets far bigger than they actually were. I attribute a lot of that to the backdrops of this episode, which mainly consist of mountain ranges in the far distance. While these are very obviously paintings, they do a wonderful job at enhancing these sets in terms of their scale. These locations look so much bigger because of them, like they go on for miles on end. It isn't just the mountains though, there's also a huge amount of detail in the set dressing, like Toby's shed for example, with moss growing on the roof, and rusty chains dangling from it, there's logs and scrap littered all around. It gives a strong sense of neglect, and gets the message across that this railway is on a decline. How about this set with the ruined castle in the background? It's not just a well detailed set piece, but it helps the set stand out from the others. Or this set, where the line curves between two mountains, with extremely rough rock faces, and all the little bushes and plants scattered around. Finally, my favourite example is this set of the lake with the bridge at the back. The lake itself looks pretty good, the added effect of ripples in the water brings it to life, even if it is static. There's more rough rock faces next to the line, then combine that with the mountain backdrop, it all comes together for a fantastic shot. I can only assume the film crew really loved these sets as well, considering the amount of extra footage there is of either Thomas or Percy running on them. Perhaps these were intended for other episodes, but it could also just be that they wanted to get as much as they could from these sets before having to take them down. I can't really think of any other way to put it. Even years later, this episode is just a visual delight from start to finish. And honestly, I would argue it to be one of the best looking episodes in the entire series. Now when it comes to the story of this episode, there isn't too much to go over. It's pretty straightforward. It focuses on Toby going about his business on his tramway, as it begins to decline in traffic, and how this will impact not just the line, but him and his coach Henrietta. But there are some aspects I'd like to highlight. This is the first episode in which we see the Fat Controller not in his usual form. Here he's just a regular person on holiday with his family, and it's nice to see a different side to him compared to the controlling figure we know so well. Though that experience with railways and engines is still very apparent, since he easily identifies what type of engine Toby is to his grandchildren.
"That's a tram engine, Stephen," said the Fat Controller. "But trams are electric, aren't they?" "They are mostly, but this is a steam tram."
Though a more significant case of this is his short conversation with Toby after the first journey. Not only does he thank him for the ride, but he also asks him for his name. The Fat Controller obviously knows that these engines aren't soulless machines. There are clear personalities and life behind them, and that knowledge is applied here, even with an engine not on his railway. He understands that engines work really hard, and respects that, which Toby clearly appreciates.
This gentleman, he thought, is a gentleman who knows how to speak to engines.
Speaking of Toby, in terms of his character, there isn't a whole lot to say for this episode specifically. It's mostly him being cheerful with his new recent passengers, and being sad when they go away and the line closes. Pretty simple, nothing wrong with it of course, there just isn't really much to say. There is one thing that sticks out though, something that is really only in this episode, and that is Toby's apparent dislike of electric trams, or at least being mistaken for being one.
Is it electric? Asked Bridget. Whoosh! Hissed Toby.
Like, Bridget simply asked a very harmless question, and not even in a rude way, yet Toby reacts very aggressively, as well as dwells on it afterwards.
Electric indeed! Electric indeed! He snorted.
Around the time the original story was written, steam trams were being phased out by electric ones, so it does make sense that Toby might have some disdain for them, and being associated with them. It would also make sense that someone would mistake him as electric, as steam ones would be more rare at this point, so they'd likely never knew they existed. This is honestly a very interesting side to Toby. It shows that even someone as level-headed as him can still have at least one thing that gets under his skin. It's kind of surprising and honestly a shame that this is never explored further in either the TV series or even the Railway series. I think some great stories could have come from it. But one thing about this episode that is especially well done is its overall tone. Toby and the Stout Gentleman is what I would consider to be the first sad episode of the series. There have of course been sad moments up to this point, but the episodes those scenes were a part of mainly had more different tones. Sad Story of Henry, for example, was more of a comedic episode, considering the absurdity of it, from an engine hiding in the tunnel to people trying to get it out by pulling and pushing it. Stout Gentleman, however, is rather consistent in having a rather downcast tone, like the opening. Despite the upbeat music and lovely visuals, there's narration that explains the dire situation the railway is in.
Remembering that she used to be full and 9 trucks would rattle behind her. Now there are only 3 or 4, and the farms and factories send their goods mostly by lorry. The buses are crowded and Henrietta is empty.
Then there's the scene where Toby says goodbye to the Fat Controller's family. This is often picked on for the close-up shot of Toby staring into the camera with that sad expression, and yeah, even I'll admit it's pretty horrifying. But at the same time, I love the detail of Toby tearing up here, because it shows how much the family leaving hurts. These are the first passengers that they've had in presumably a long time, and they not only enjoyed their time, but the Fat Controller in particular greatly respected Toby. Now they're going, with the promise of coming back. A promise they never get to fulfill, as the line closes not long after this. But it's the execution of the next few scenes that I think are worthy of praise. And one aspect that makes them great is the music, or more accurately, lack of music. Aside from a couple of short ditties, the music is pretty much absent, and the episode relies more on sound and small bits of narration to maintain the tone. There are 2 main areas that I'd like to show this. After Toby says goodbye to the Hat family, we get this short sequence of the windmill.
The months passed. Toby had few trucks and fewer passengers.
All we have in terms of sound is a calm yet chilling wind ambience, the distant puffing from Toby, and a single bit of narration that perfectly sums up the current situation. Things are just getting worse and worse for the railway. It only lasts a few seconds, but the sequence is very effective. And finally, there's Toby pulling his last full train down the line. Again, there's just the wind and Toby's puffing fading away as he trundles down the hill past the ruined castle. A very quiet and sombre moment. Despite being a big day with so many people, it isn't one to be excited about for Toby, his crew, and Henrietta, and this small sequence captures how they're likely feeling. There's nothing to say or do to stop the closure. All they can do is just quietly accept it and perform their final journey. Now, this isn't an episode I would say is overly sad, but even now, the efforts made to have this be a very sorrowful and grim episode are very much appreciated. Of course though, it isn't all doom and gloom, as seen by the end, with Toby and his crew receiving a letter from the Fat Controller. I do love the way this episode ends on a cliffhanger. We don't know yet what's going to happen, but hearing the driver sound so excited, and the final shot of Toby smiling, gives a lot of reassurance. Their line may be gone and forgotten, but they certainly weren't. In conclusion, I consider Toby and the Stout Gentleman to be a pretty underrated gem in Thomas, not just in Season 1, but the series as a whole. It has a very unique aesthetic, boasting some wonderful visuals with its vast landscapes and huge mountain ranges, all pulled off with well-placed cameras and highly detailed paintings. It's the first time we see the Fat Controller in a new way, and has a consistent and very well-handled tone. And of course, it introduced a very iconic and beloved character in Toby. I don't think I've ever disliked this episode, but it didn't always come to my mind when thinking of episodes I really love. Usually episodes like Haunted Henry, Stepney Gets Lost, or Rusty and the Boulder, as I mentioned earlier, would come to my mind. Bigger, more crazy, and, in some cases, more darker stories tended to be my favourite. In more recent years though, maybe it's because I've gotten older, I say that as someone who's only in their 20s, I've grown to love more slower, smaller stories. Ones that don't have a whole lot going on in them, but can still be very engaging, have an interesting story and or likeable characters. That's not to say I can't enjoy more fast-paced, action-packed stories, but sometimes something more quiet and simpler can be nice as well. I think it's also this reason why I've come to consider Season 1 of Thomas to be my favourite season. Its calm pace, small cast of characters, and straightforward plots can make for a very relaxing experience. And Toby and the Stout Gentleman is no exception.